Hi. So today I'm here to tell you about a mission that I have, and that is to have an orgasmic birth. Now, I heard about this for the first time last year, and I was somewhat intrigued. I had received an email for a course, but I didn't really have a need to take a course for an orgasmic birth because I was not pregnant at the time. This year it came around, it's only once a year, and I decided to take it. So I will do a full review of it once I put more of the ideas into practice, and actually probably after my birth, because it's probably pretty dependent on how successful I am. But I'm also doing many other things aside from what is specifically detailed in this course. So I will continue to tell you about that. This is going to be sort of a random installments kind of series. But this week, instead of watching a Christmas movie while wrapping gifts, I decided to watch a movie called Orgasmic Birth, which you can watch for $6 on Vimeo if you're interested. I know there is a book as well, both of which I'll link to. I haven't read that yet, but I probably plan to at some point. Now, my last birth was far from orgasmic, but I do believe it is possible because ultimately, all of the pathways involved in sexual pleasure are involved in birthing a baby. This is also something that almost every other mammal experiences, and they don't have the same type of interventions and needs for synthetic hormones, etc., as we do. So when you're giving birth naturally, powerful hormones are released that not only make it more efficient as long as you're not taking artificial hormones, but also the highest level of oxytocin a woman will ever make is after giving birth. And when you take Pitocin for induction, which is an artificial hormone, you're starting on the path of interventions, and your need for an epidural increases and the likelihood of a C-section goes up. So I do want to take a minute or a few minutes to talk about hormones. Now, oxytocin is the feel-good love hormone that plays a huge role in birth. And if labor starts naturally and continues naturally, you will more likely have the chance for an orgasmic birth. What oxytocin does is it facilitates bonding, trust, stress relief, and specifically softening of the cervix. And when oxytocin is flowing, it activates this calming connection response. It relaxes the cervix, and it allows the outer and the inner muscles of the birth canal to open. There's another hormone called Beta-endorphin, and that's here to act as a natural pain reliever, and it puts a woman in an alternate state of consciousness, which really helps as that pain relief. Adrenaline also comes in at some point, especially when it's time to push. So that's also there to help you as a naturally occurring hormone. And just before the baby is born, the mama's production of oxytocin peaks, and it floods the system with this love hormone. And there are several benefits to this surge, including providing mama with tons of ammunition to fall in love with her child and to have ultimate bonding time, which should happen right after birth. So if your child is whisked away from you at a hospital, this is also disrupting a really important part of the birth process. Now, this peak level of oxytocin, unfortunately, does not occur with synthetic Pitocin. So if you need to be induced, which is the case a lot these days in hospitals, even in birth centers, which was my experience for my last birth, which I've talked about before in at least one video. Usually they give you Pitocin, which is this synthetic hormone I mentioned earlier. I personally did not get Pitocin, which I'm grateful for. Most of what I'm going to talk about is about Pitocin. They gave me misoprostol. I don't know if it has all of these side effects, but it's certainly something to look into a little bit more if you need to be induced for whatever reason. But Pitocin tends to give you bigger contractions, which make mama more uncomfortable. It overstimulates the uterus, and it stresses the baby, and it will cause more women to need to take an epidural and cause more C-sections. It also contributes to low levels of beta-endorphins, which, as I mentioned before, put a woman in this alternate state of consciousness and provide natural pain relief. And unfortunately, Pitocin also reduces the amount of oxytocin a mom's going to secrete in the days following birth. And that can affect milk production and your feelings toward your baby in general, which I think is a big reason for the increase in postpartum depression these days. So now that I've given you kind of a brief intro to hormones, if you're also on a quest to have an orgasmic birth, my biggest tip is to make sure you don't need to be induced, which will set you up for a guaranteed fail with synthetic hormones. So even if you're giving birth in a hospital, talk to your doctors about when they'll require you to be induced and let them know that that's not what you want. There's a good chance that my hospital may have been more flexible if I did not want to give birth in the birth center. But most hospitals will want you to give birth according to their timeline and not your baby's. So if this is something that is important to you, have that conversation with your doctor and basically say, I don't want to be induced. How far can I go? And hopefully they can have that conversation, but have that conversation well in advance. So if you don't like their answers, you can look for an alternate way or place to give birth. So far in my quest to have an orgasmic birth, I've done a few things. First, I took a course about orgasmic birth, which again, I'll talk about a little bit more in future videos, and I'll do a full review. I also watched that video that I talked about. Second, I've made the decision to do a home birth, so I'm not forced to be induced and I can be in the comfort of my own home. The reason this is kind of important is because women need to feel comfortable and in a safe environment, because ultimately you have to surrender. And that can be a lot harder to do with bright lights and a million strangers around you. If you can get off with strangers in the room, you will be much more likely to succeed in having an orgasmic birth in a hospital. That is personally not my deal. So I don't want to try to achieve my orgasm in a hospital. Ultimately, you just need to relax so your body can open. And in a hospital, that's really hard to do. And the last thing, and I think the last thing I'm going to talk about today, is to actually believe it's possible. Most of the depiction of birth in our culture comes from movies and TV shows where moms are screaming for their lives, threatening their partners, etc. I know it's really not talked about as much, but there really is another way. So stay away from movies or TV shows that have depictions of those types of birth. And try to spend time watching positive birth stories. There are many books that talk about birth, especially way back when it was more before we started the whole hospital birthing process, and how it was a lot more common to not necessarily have an orgasmic birth, but just have an unmedicated birth, and that it wasn't that big a deal. So I'll link to some of the books that I've read and talk a little bit more about positive experience, but start trying to look into positive birth stories. At the end of this movie, the orgasmic birth movie that I watched, they made a good point, which I thought was kind of interesting. They said the reason people with great births aren't shared is because they don't want to make a woman who had a C-section birth or a terrible birth experience feel bad. And I understand that. I don't think that anybody should be judged for the birth that they had, especially if they didn't necessarily have control over it. But I also think, and the movie reflected this, that I think it is really important to, if you do have a good birth story, to actually share it so people know that it is a different option. So ultimately, if you do have this, I would love to talk to you, and maybe we can come up with some great positive birth stories that I can share on this channel. So I'm going to continue to update you with more tips on how to achieve this, and ultimately, if I'm able to have an orgasmic birth. Even if I don't, that doesn't mean that you can't and you shouldn't try. Regardless of my experience, I've heard several people talk about their stories, and it's very encouraging. So if you want to continue to hear more about my progress in and my attempt to have an orgasmic birth, or just to get health tips for preggers, please subscribe to my channel, Paleo Preggers. And if you have a positive birth story to share, please contact me. And that's it for today. So happy almost New Year, and I will see you next time. Bye.